Dawn in Maplewood had a special silence, broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of an early rising neighbor's lawnmower. The streets were wide, lined with ancient oaks that formed green tunnels over the sidewalks. The houses, each different but equally well kept, reflected the quiet pride of those who believed in community life. There, the doors were rarely locked during the day. It was the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever seemed to happen. In the middle of this perfect neighborhood lived Margaret Collins, 42, with her light brown hair tied in a practical way and a calm gaze that exuded confidence. At first glance, she was just another busy mother, balancing shopping, household chores, and her children's schedules. He was never late for a school appointment and always had a kind word for anyone he met along the way. His presence was so constant that it seemed like an invisible pillar supporting the harmony of the street. Every morning, the ritual was the same. Margaret would walk down the stairs with soft steps, turn on the yellow kitchen light, and let the aroma of breakfast waft through. Bread, eggs, and fruit were already arranged carefully on the weathered wooden table. The white cotton curtains swayed gently in the cool breeze that came through the window. The simple setting exuded a homey warmth that made any visitor feel welcome. In the corner of the garage, always parked in the same spot, sat her metallic blue minivan, an older model with a few scratches and a faded high school baseball team sticker. To the neighbors, it was a modest, unremarkable car. To Margaret, it was also a perfect disguise. She could have any car she wanted, but this one served to reinforce the image of a middle-class mother she cultivated with almost surgical precision. Mornings in the Collins household were lively and chaotic. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, laughter, and the children's arguments over who would use the bathroom first. Margaret circled the kitchen like a maestro conducting an improvised orchestra, making sure everyone left fed and with the right backpacks. She smiled and complained, all in the right measure to seem like just another mother trying to survive the routine. The entire neighborhood knew Margaret as a trustworthy and involved person. She was always present at PTA meetings, organized raffles to help the baseball team, and prepared desserts for community parties. She was the kind of person who remembered neighbors' birthdays and brought flowers to those who were sick. Nothing in her behavior indicated anything beyond that modest and predictable life. But behind her welcoming smile lay a colossal secret. A secret so skillfully guarded that in over 20 years it had never been revealed. Margaret wasn't just a devoted housewife. She was the only bank account holder with $120 million, a fortune capable of changing destinies, but which remained invisible to everyone around him. The origin of this money was known only to her and the lawyer who had handled the case decades earlier. A multi-million-dollar settlement, the result of a legal battle against a tech giant, had fallen into her hands when she was still in her early 20s. A victory that came with a confidentiality agreement and the most difficult decision of her life: never to tell anyone. She deeply believed that money had the power to corrupt relationships and distort feelings. Therefore, she decided to live as if she didn't have any. Her home was comfortable but far from luxurious. Her clothes came from discount stores, and her children grew up believing that families, like any other, needed to control their spending and avoid excess. As she set the table that morning, Margaret watched through the window as Mrs. Henderson watered the flowers in the garden. The neighbor, known for her sharp tongue, waved cheerfully. "Good morning, Margaret. Already heading to the market?" she asked, with that smile that seemed to convey more than just friendliness. Margaret returned the wave naturally. "Yeah, just picking up some things for the kids' breakfast," he replied, keeping his tone casual. He knew every word exchanged was a part of the character he played day after day. The sun illuminated the white facade of her house, reflecting off the glass of the front door. Margaret noticed how innocent and predictable everything seemed. No one passing by that street could imagine that within that seemingly simple house there was an invisible safe, pulsing silently thousands of miles away. Sometimes, when she was alone, she felt the weight of the secret. She wondered if she could maintain this charade for the rest of her life, or if at some point fate would find a way to expose everything. But she quickly pushed these thoughts away, reminding herself that her mission was to protect not only her money, but the very essence of the people around her. The morning breeze carried the scent of roses from the neighboring garden, mingled with the smell of fresh bread from the local bakery. She took a deep breath, letting that simplicity fill her senses. It was in these small details that she found true peace. However, there were nights when the silence in the house became too heavy. In those moments, she wondered what her life would be like if she had chosen to show off, if she had mansions, expensive cars, international travel. The answer was always accompanied by a feeling of emptiness. She knew the price of showing the truth would be losing what she valued most: genuine relationships. Tyler, her eldest son, ran downstairs, throwing his backpack on the table. Emily followed close behind, complaining that he had eaten the last of the yogurt. Margaret intervened with the practiced patience of someone who'd lived through this scene hundreds of times. It was in these small conflicts that she found the foundation of her simple life. As she loaded the children into the minivan, she felt a strange chill. She glanced down the street and saw an unfamiliar car parked at the end of the block. The driver seemed to be scanning the neighborhood carefully. Margaret quickly looked away, trying to ignore the unease it provoked. She started the engine and drove down the street, waving to other neighbors who were already starting their day. At that moment, no one, absolutely no one, could have guessed that this ordinary woman, with her worn-out minivan and kind smile, was one of the richest people in the state. And that is exactly how Margaret wanted it to stay. Inside her, however, a small voice whispered, "Secrets don't stay hidden forever." Margaret's past was like a photo album tucked away in the back of a drawer. Few people knew the images she hid there. Before becoming the devoted and seemingly ordinary mother of Maplewood, she had been a brilliant young woman at the University of Illinois, passionate about computer science and driven by the dream of creating something that would change the world. She would spend entire nights in the library, programming until her eyes burned. It was there that fate began to unravel its secret. At 21, Margaret developed a groundbreaking algorithm to optimize communication processes between devices, a technology that could save any company millions. At the time, she had no idea of the true value of what she had created. She proudly showed the project to a professor, believing it was about to open doors for her career. But what came next wasn't recognition. It was betrayal. Months later, Margaret discovered that a tech giant had launched a product using her very idea. Without her name, without her permission, without even a thank you. Outrage consumed her. After days of crying and sleepless nights, she sought out a lawyer, a man named Howard Lasker, specialist in intellectual property cases. Howard believed her. He gathered evidence, brought in experts, and began a legal battle that lasted nearly 3 years. For Margaret, it was years of anxiety, hearings, and uncertainty. Many said she was wasting her time against a powerful company, but she refused to give up. In 2006, the turning point came. The court ruled in Margaret's favor. The compensation was historic: $120 million deposited in a fund controlled by his lawyer. However, there was one unforgiving clause: absolute secrecy. Disclosing any information could cost you everything, and even bring retaliation. Margaret signed the contract without hesitation. The money was there, safe. But along with it came the certainty that she would need to reinvent her life to protect this invisible treasure. Thus she began to build her new identity. A simple woman with a predictable routine, whom no one would ever suspect was a millionaire. At first, the temptation to use part of her fortune was strong. She could have bought a huge house, traveled the world, and worn designer clothes. but something inside her told her that showing off would be like shining a beacon in the middle of the night, attracting curious people and opportunists. And so she chose to live as if nothing had changed. A few months after the court victory, she met Tom Collins, a friendly, soft-spoken civil engineer. They fell in love quickly. He saw her as an intelligent, hard-working woman, but never suspected the weight of her past. Margaret knew that telling the truth would change their relationship forever, so she remained silent. They married the following summer in a simple ceremony in the backyard of her parents' house. Margaret's dress was elegant, but not extravagant. Only Howard, her lawyer, looked at her with the knowledge that beneath that radiant smile lurked a secret worth millions. Over the years, Margaret learned to live with her dual identity. In front of others, she worried about bills, made shopping lists, and talked about saving for her children's college education. Alone, she would access her fund statement and see numbers that would make her seem like a myth in the eyes of the community. But the secret required discipline. No credit cards linked to the million-dollar account. No purchases that would raise suspicions. Everything was done with normal money, coming from Tom's work and small investments she kept as a cover. It was like living a meticulously rehearsed play. Sometimes Margaret wondered if Howard still had copies of the plea agreement. The elderly lawyer sent her Christmas cards, but never mentioned the case. Their trust was strong, but the fear of leaks was always lingering in her mind. After all, nothing stays hidden forever. It was one winter night, years later, that Margaret had a strange premonition. She was in the living room, reading a book when the landline rang. On the other end, a husky male voice said, "I know who you are and what you're hiding." The call dropped before she could answer. She tried to convince herself it was just a prank, maybe a mistake, but the uneasiness remained. For days she watched the street through the window, searching for unfamiliar faces, and she began to notice details that had previously been unnoticed. A car parked for hours on the corner, a man pretending to walk his dog and frequently glancing at her house. The sense of security she'd always felt in Maplewood began to unravel, and for the first time, Margaret wondered if her cover was about to collapse.
He decided to increase his caution. She avoided going out alone at night, reinforced the door locks, and began keeping the children at a friend's house when Tom was away, all without revealing anything to anyone. The less people knew, the easier it would be to protect them. One cold morning, when she opened her mailbox, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside, just a photo, her, sitting on a park bench, reading. On the back, a handwritten sentence, "The money won't stay hidden forever." Margaret's heart raced. This was no coincidence. Someone really knew. And worse, they were willing to play with her mind before acting. Over the next few days, she began to feel like the whole town was watching her. Conversations at the supermarket seemed to stop when she passed. The normally talkative mailman became more serious. Even Mrs. Henderson, always curious, seemed to measure her words more carefully. Margaret knew she needed to think fast. The secret she had kept for more than 2 decades was at risk. But the question that tormented her most wasn't who knew, and yes, how this person had discovered it. And deep down, an even more dangerous thought began to form. If someone had information about the money, maybe it wasn't a stranger. Maybe it was someone much closer than she wanted to believe. The morning chill spread across the streets of Maplewood like a thin veil of mist. Margaret was in the kitchen, slowly stirring her coffee, when she heard heavy footsteps on the porch. It was unusual for that hour. She dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. Opening it, she found her brother-in-law, Peter Collins, standing with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Peter was Tom's younger brother. A tall man, always well-dressed, with a somewhat hurried way of speaking. He appeared a few times a year, usually unannounced.
That day, he carried a strange energy, as if he were carrying something he didn't want to reveal right away. "Margaret," he said, opening his arms, "I was passing through town and thought I'd visit you." She smiled, but something about his expression made her stomach lurch. It had been years since she'd seen him so observant. They entered and sat at the table. Peter looked around, as if taking in every detail of the house. His gaze slid on a framed photo of Margaret and the children in the park. Then it slid to the antique clock on the wall, and then to the impeccably organized kitchen. "You keep everything so low-key, Maggie," he said, using a nickname that rarely came out of his mouth. "It doesn't seem like—" He stopped mid-sentence and smiled, "that you live in such an expensive neighborhood." Margaret felt a shiver. The pause before the "what" seemed loaded with meaning. She tried to keep his tone light. "Oh, Peter, it's peaceful here, and it's not that expensive compared to other cities." He nodded, but his eyes continued to scan the room. Margaret knew that look. It wasn't one of admiration. It was one of someone searching for clues. She remembered the mysterious envelope she'd received days earlier and felt the weight of coincidence. As they talked, Peter began asking unusual questions. He wanted to know about Tom's finances, if the kids' college tuition was paid for, if she had any plans to travel this summer. The questions were laced with smiles, but their insistence was evident. "What about you, Maggie? Do you do anything now?" he asked, stirring his coffee. "I just take care of the house and the kids. You know, the routine is tough." Peter smirked. "Yeah, but they say sometimes we have hidden resources that even those closest to us don't realize." The sentence hung in the air, like a stone about to fall. Margaret took a deep breath, keeping her gaze calm, but inside, her heart was racing. After a few minutes of vague conversation, he mentioned that he needed to take care of personal matters in town and might spend a few more days in Maplewood. Margaret nodded, but inside, she began planning how to monitor her brother-in-law's movements. That night, she told Tom about the unexpected visit. Unable to grasp the full weight of the situation, he simply laughed. "Ah, Peter is just like that, always curious." Margaret didn't answer. The feeling grew within her that this wasn't just curiosity. The next day, as she was taking the children to school, she saw Peter talking to Mrs. Henderson in the neighbor's garden. They were laughing, but when Margaret passed by, they fell silent for a few seconds. The chills ran down her spine again. Later, while washing the dishes, she saw Peter in the backyard staring at the house with a thoughtful expression. He pretended to be on the phone, but Margaret could tell his attention was completely on her. She decided to proceed with caution. She called Howard, her lawyer, and asked him to strengthen the bank's security by changing passwords and protocols. Howard, intrigued, asked if there was a problem. "Just a bad feeling," she replied. Peter began appearing wherever she was, at the grocery store, at the coffee shop, even at the library where Margaret was checking out books for Emily. Every time she saw him, she wondered, was he following her, or was it just a coincidence? On the third night after his stay, Peter invited the family to dinner at a restaurant in town. During the meal, he asked questions about investments, real estate, and inheritances. Tom answered calmly, but Margaret could tell he was mentally jotting down every detail. When they returned home, Margaret stayed up late trying to piece together the pieces. The envelope, the mysterious call, the strange car on the street, and now Peter. It was impossible not to connect the dots. The next day, she found a second envelope in her mailbox. Inside was just one sentence. "He's closer than you think." No signature, no explanation. Margaret felt her stomach churn. She didn't know if the message was about Peter or if he had sent it. But one thing was clear. Someone was manipulating the situation to make her vulnerable. She decided she needed to turn the tables. She began discreetly recording every detail of her brother-in-law's movements, times, places he visited, people he spoke to. If necessary, she would have proof. But what frightened her most was the fact that despite all her caution, Peter always seemed one step ahead, as if he already knew what she would do before she even acted. On the 5th day of his stay, he knocked on the door with a smile. "Maggie, I thought, what if we talked alone? There are things I want to ask you." The way he said alone made the air in the kitchen feel heavier. Margaret, keeping her disguise, agreed. But inside her, something screamed that this moment could change everything. If Peter really knew about the 120 million, life as she knew it was about to unravel.
Margaret closed the door behind Peter and led him into the living room. The afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, painting the carpet with streaks of gold. The atmosphere was so calm it was almost suffocating. She sat on the sofa, while he deliberately took the chair opposite. Peter spent a few seconds observing the surroundings, as if memorizing every detail. The initial silence was broken by a seemingly banal comment. "Nice house. But you always had a way of hiding things." His gaze was fixed, almost challenging. Margaret smiled politely, trying to hide her discomfort. "I don't know what you're talking about. My life is very simple." "Ah, simple," he repeated, with a hint of irony. "That's a funny word, isn't it? So many things seem simple until you look closely." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was thinking, you haven't worked outside the home since you married my brother. Still, I've never seen you guys strapped for cash." "Tom is good at managing," she replied quickly. "He always has been." Peter chuckled softly. "Administration or something else?" he said, pausing mid-sentence as if he wanted her to finish the sentence. Margaret crossed her legs, keeping her gaze calm. "Peter, if you have something to say, say it." He gave a long, theatrical sigh. "Let's just say I received some curious information. A story about an old lawsuit. A very, very generous compensation." Margaret's blood ran cold, but her face remained impassive. "Stories are stories," he said, almost whispering, "and people love to make them up." "I agree," he replied, smiling. "But what about when the story is accompanied by evidence?" Margaret kept her hands tightly in her lap, but inside, her heart was beating like a drum. Peter took something out of his pocket, a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table, but didn't open it. "Here's something that might interest you, or scare you. It depends on how you look at it." The sound of a clock on the wall seemed to tick away with more force each second. She took a deep breath before touching the paper. "What if I say I don't want to know?" "Then I would say you have a lot more to hide than you realize." Peter leaned back in his chair, watching her reaction. "I'm not here to steal anything, Maggie. But if you want to protect what's yours, maybe it's time we talked about terms." The word conditions sounded like a carefully wrapped threat. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the anonymous envelope. "Did you send that photo?" she asked firmly. He looked genuinely confused. "Photo? What photo?" It was impossible to know if he was lying, but the quick glance he cast to the side didn't go unnoticed. "Peter, if you know something, say it now." "I know that the money is not safe." The sentence hung in the air, thick as smoke. Margaret felt the weight of it, but kept control. "And what do you suggest?" she asked. "I suggest you let me handle this. In return, I'll make sure no one else finds out." Margaret gave a short, humorless laugh.
Do you want to blackmail me, Peter? I prefer to call it partnership. The mood in the room grew even more tense. Outside, a car drove slowly down the street, the sound of its engine echoing. Peter didn't look away for a second. Think about it, Maggie. I can be your best ally or your worst problem. She stood up slowly, as if deciding to end the conversation. I'll think about it, she said coldly. But until then, I want you to stay away from my family. Peter also stood up, but with a satisfied smile, as if he had already won half the battle. Before leaving, he stopped at the door and looked over his shoulder. Oh, and just for the record, you weren't the only one who received that envelope. And then he was gone, leaving the sound of the door echoing through the house. Margaret stood alone in the room, the paper still closed on the table. Part of her wanted to burn it without looking, but the other part, more curious and fearful, knew she had to see what was there. With trembling hands, she unfolded the paper. Inside was a blurry copy of a court document, the compensation claim. In the corner, a handwritten note. He is not alone. The silence in the house now seemed to scream. Margaret knew. Someone else knew. And the net around her was closing in faster than she had ever imagined. Margaret, however, had already made a silent decision. She would not be hunted. She would be the hunter.
The next morning, Margaret woke early, before the sun had even fully risen. The house was silent except for the distant sound of birds. She sat at the kitchen table, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the decision she had to make. Every move that day would be crucial. The first step was to call Howard, your trusted lawyer. Howard, I need you to look into all suspicious activity related to the fund, he said, his voice firm but thick with tension. He immediately understood the gravity of the situation and promised to begin a detailed audit. Margaret then decided to discreetly install cameras and sensors throughout the house. She needed to know who was coming in, who was leaving, and if anyone was trying to get close to her or the children. Technology was her ally, but also a reminder that she couldn't trust anyone. As he adjusted the cameras, he noticed something strange in the yard. A car parked at the end of the street, the same one he'd seen a few days earlier. The driver seemed to be watching every move. She made a mental note of the license plate and model, recording everything for the police and Howard. Tom still didn't realize the real risk. Margaret continued her normal routine, preparing coffee and backpacks for the children, smiling as always. But inside, her brain was racing, strategies, possibilities, contingency plans. She knew Peter was not alone. The note in the envelope clearly said, he is not alone. There were more people involved, perhaps someone with access to your daily life. And figuring out who would be the #1 priority. Margaret began reviewing every contact, every call, every email she received. She tried to identify patterns, deviations, signs of an interest in money. Everything was a clue, and every detail counted. In the afternoon of the same day, she received an unexpected visit. Her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had always been curious, appeared with cakes and sweets. Margaret smiled, but her attention was on the woman's every gesture. She looked around the house at the living room, as if evaluating rather than observing. As they talked, Margaret noticed the same look as before, measuring, calculating, trying to find something out of the ordinary. She kept her smile, offering tea and biscuits, but inside her, every sense of normalcy dissolved. The next night, Margaret decided it was time for a bolder move. She grabbed her laptop and began discreetly tracking Peter's movements and potential allies on social media. Every post, every comment, every check-in could reveal clues. She soon discovered something surprising. Peter had recently met with a former lawyer who knew details of his case. The connection was clear. He was gathering information from professionals who could help track the fortune. Margaret then began to act in anticipation. She transferred a portion of the fund to a new, completely secret account using even more stringent security protocols. The objective was simple: to confuse and protect. She left behind a fake account with just a few $1,000s, enough to fool any hacking or espionage attempts. If Peter or anyone else tried to access it, they would believe they were reaching the real fund. Over the next few days, Margaret began discreetly recording all interactions with Peter and his acquaintances. Microphones hidden in common objects picked up conversations, words and tones that could serve as evidence. The tension in the house grew. Every out-of-place sound made Margaret hold her breath. The children began to notice their mother's anxiety, but she managed to hide it with hugs and smiles. One day, she found an envelope in the neighborhood mail with no return address. Inside, just the phrase, "You're playing the wrong game." Margaret realized that someone was trying to intimidate her, but also revealing her movement. She knew she needed to go further. She contacted a private detective, a discreet and experienced man, to track down Peter and suspicious contacts. Every step would be monitored, every movement recorded. In the midst of this chaos, Margaret still maintained the perfect facade. She took the children to school, went to the supermarket, chatted with neighbors. It was a delicate balance between normality and surveillance. One rainy morning, she noticed Peter rush out of the house, looking around. Margaret smiled internally. Finally, a slip. He hadn't known he was being monitored. She then devised a bold plan. She would intentionally leave false clues, testing who would actually try to achieve the fortune. It was time to turn the tables. The next day, Peter received an email with information that Margaret knew to be false. He reacted exactly as she expected: curious, interested, and cautious. The tension of the cat-and-mouse game was increasing. Meanwhile, Margaret organized her life. She maintained routines, took care of the children, prepared meals, but every detail was planned so as not to arouse suspicion. The detectives sent daily reports detailing the movements of Peter and his potential allies. Margaret analyzed every line, every schedule, every pattern of behavior. She realized that the network was even bigger than she imagined. Peter was just the tip of the iceberg. There were others, invisible, moving in the shadows. Margaret felt a chill down her spine, but at the same time an internal fire ignited. She would not be a victim. She was ready to become the huntress. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace, she plotted her next step. Every move would be calculated, every interaction used as a trap. The game had just begun. Margaret looked at the children, sleeping peacefully. "Don't worry," she murmured to herself. "Mommy will take care of everything." And with a last glance at the discreetly placed cameras, she whispered, "It's time to find out who's really on my side and who will pay to discover the secret."
Night fell heavily over Maplewood. The streets were silent except for the rustling of trees in the wind. Margaret lay awake, watching every movement on the block through the cameras. She knew something was coming. She could feel the tension in the air that precedes a storm. The detective sent a message. "Suspicious movement detected on your street. Caution is advised." Margaret took a deep breath and pressed her fingers against the table, her heart racing. Finally, the game was reaching its critical moment. Across the street, two cars slowly pulled up, almost simultaneously. Unfamiliar figures got out, watching the house intently. Margaret analyzed every detail, recognizing Peter's pattern in every movement. She decided to play it cool. She called Tom, making up some excuse for him to take the kids to a school event. "Honey, don't be long," he said, completely oblivious. Margaret hung up the phone and walked to the secret vault. Every step was calculated. She needed to ensure that even if they were discovered, the intruders would find nothing. The house's exterior lights were off. Margaret discreetly activated sound sensors and extra cameras, all connected to her laptop in the living room. Every breath of the intruders would be recorded. Outside, Peter entered a neighbor's house, seemingly casually, but in fact monitoring the family's routine. Margaret knew he was looking for information and planning his next move. She set up digital traps, fake passwords, fake accounts, and automatic alerts that would make any hacking attempt seem impossible. The cat-and-mouse game reached its peak. Meanwhile, the figures from the other car began to approach the yard, trying not to be seen. Margaret noticed from the security camera that they were equipped with burglary tools. She took a deep breath and went into command mode. "Time to test what I've learned," she muttered to herself, her voice firm. The first attempt to open the fake safe failed. An automatic alert triggered external lights and sounds that simulated an active security system. The intruders retreated, but did not give up. Margaret took advantage of the distraction and discreetly called the detective, who was already nearby monitoring every movement. "They're trying to break in," she said quietly. The intruders realized something was wrong. One of them retreated to the car while the other tried to access a side entrance. Their every step was recorded by hidden cameras. Margaret remained calm, watching every gesture. She knew any mistake could be fatal. "Don't be fooled," he thought. "No one enters without my permission." In the backyard, Peter and his ally advanced cautiously, but Margaret had foreseen everything. She activated automatic lights, sounds, and alerts that created the sensation of people being in the house. Confused, the invaders hesitated. Peter, realizing something was wrong, stepped back and tried to contact the other. Margaret smiled slightly, pleased with the reaction. Meanwhile, the detective approached silently from the opposite side of the street. He captured photos, videos, and details that would serve as evidence. Margaret observed every detail, analyzing movement patterns, hesitations, and expressions. He knew this would be crucial to dismantling the web surrounding his secret. The intruders, sensing the presence of surveillance, began to retreat. Peter stepped back last, looking straight at the house, with a frustrated but calculated smile. Margaret temporarily shut down the system, taking a deep breath. Adrenaline was still coursing through her body, but the immediate danger had passed. She knew this was just the beginning. Peter and the others would still plan something bigger, but now she had the advantage: information, control, and predictability. She sat in the room looking at the cameras and the detective's reports. "I knew it wouldn't be easy," she murmured, "but now you're going to play by my rules." In the early hours of the morning while the city slept, Margaret plotted her next move. Every move would be calculated, every interaction used as a trap. The game was just beginning, and this time she was fully prepared.
It was a stormy night in Maplewood. The rain beat hard against the windows, and the wind made the tree branches scrape against the roof. Margaret watched from the living room, sitting with her laptop in front of her, monitoring every movement outside. She knew Peter would come. The phone rang, an unexpected call. The display showed only a string of unfamiliar numbers. Margaret answered, keeping her voice calm. "Margaret, it's time we talked in person." On the other end, Peter's voice sounded confident, almost defiant. He demanded that they meet in a secluded city park near the lake. Margaret felt a shiver, but decided to accept. It was her chance to face head-on the one who threatened her life and her secret. She put on a heavy coat and took an umbrella, leaving the children and Tom in the care of a trustworthy neighbor. "That's all," he murmured. "We'll sort everything out later." The park was deserted, with the light from the street lamps reflecting off the murky water of the lake. Peter was already there, leaning against the edge of the bridge, staring at Margaret's house in the distance. "Margaret," he began, approaching slowly. "We finally meet face to face." "Margaret," she replied firmly, "I wanted this to be resolved without confrontation, but it seems you leave no choice." He smiled, showing confidence, but there was something calculated in the gesture. "I just want what is rightfully mine," he said, but his voice was shaking slightly. Margaret kept her gaze fixed. "And you think threatening my family and persecuting me will achieve that?" "It's not a threat," Peter retorted. "It's a negotiation." She felt a chill down her spine, but also an inner fire. "Then let's negotiate," he said, walking slowly towards him, each step measured. Peter stepped back a little, surprised by her confidence. "You've changed, Maggie. You're no longer the girl I knew as a child." "I've learned to protect what's mine," she replied, looking directly into his eyes. The wind picked up, the rain wetting their faces. "I know about the bottom," Peter said, finally facing the truth. "And I know you have a lot more than you think." Margaret took a deep breath. "And you think that scares me?" "It's scary," he admitted, "but I can't pass up the chance to claim what I consider mine." She smiled, slightly, but coldly. "You want the money? Then fight fair, or get out of my life before you regret it." Peter took a step forward, threatening. "Do you really think you can stop me alone?" Margaret lifted her chin firmly. "I've been ahead since the beginning." She knew he wasn't alone, but she couldn't show fear. "There are more people involved, Peter, and I know it." He froze for a moment, surprised. How do you know?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Observing, planning, anticipating. You underestimated my ability to predict moves," Margaret replied, her voice calm and deadly. Peter took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "So you're ready for an even more serious game?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, "and this time the rules are mine." The rain continued to fall, mixing with the tension in the air. "So, we're on equal footing?" he asked, his gaze trying to intimidate. "We never were," Margaret retorted. "You just didn't realize it before." Peter made a sudden movement, trying to intimidate, but Margaret was already expecting it. She took a step back, putting distance between them, and discreetly activated an alert on her cell phone, signaling the detective to be ready to intervene if necessary. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, finally realizing he couldn't manipulate her so easily. "And you?" Margaret countered. "Are you ready to lose?" Peter stepped back, looking at the bridge and the dark water. "This isn't over yet," he muttered, before turning and disappearing into the rain, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Margaret was left alone, wet and panting, but with a sense of victory. She knew Peter was frustrated, and that the next move would be his. But now she had the advantage: information, control, and unwavering determination. As he walked home, he thought about the next steps. "This isn't over yet," he muttered to himself, "but this time I'm in charge." As he entered the house, he felt the safe warmth of home, the smell of breakfast still fresh. The children slept peacefully, and Tom was still unaware of the confrontation that had just taken place. Margaret sat, looking at the cameras, the reports, and the security system. "The hunt has only just begun," she said softly. "But this time, I will win."
The morning sun had barely risen in Maplewood, but Margaret was already awake, sitting in front of her laptop, reviewing every detail of the previous night's break-in. The detective's reports showed curious patterns, coordinated movements, as if someone were controlling everything behind the scenes. She realized that Peter was just a piece on the board. While analyzing, he received an anonymous message on his cell phone. "The truth is bigger than you imagine. Look closer." Margaret frowned, feeling a chill run up her spine. Who would be able to send that and know his routine so well? He decided to investigate the employees of the bank where he hid the $120 million. She knew that even discreetly, someone could gain access to sensitive information. His instincts told him the threat came from within. The detective confirmed there were small, strange transactions recorded by an employee named Victor Hale, a new man who appeared trustworthy but whose digital signature appeared in records of transactions that had never been authorized. Margaret felt her heart race. She began to profile Victor. He was discreet, elegant, spoke little, but always seemed to observe and note every detail. He had access to accounts, protocols, and emergency passwords. Meanwhile, Peter continued to prowl the city. Margaret noticed through the external cameras that he was visiting nearby buildings, analyzing entrances and exits. But now she was prepared. Every move he made was being recorded. In the middle of the afternoon, Margaret received a call from Victor, who pretended to offer banking support. She remained calm, but noted every word, every tone, every hesitation. Something about him seemed rehearsed, as if he were testing her reaction. When she hung up, Margaret realized that Peter and Victor were clearly in tune. One watched her steps, while the other manipulated the fund from inside. The web was deeper and more dangerous than she had imagined. She decided to put a plan into action. She created additional fake accounts, simulating transfers that Peter and Victor could attempt to access. Every move would be monitored. Every attempt would be a trap. While configuring the systems, the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door slowly and found Peter, soaked from the previous night's rain. "We need to talk," he said, with a smile that didn't hide the tension. She let him in, keeping her distance and her posture firm. "What to talk about?" she asked, watching his every gesture. "About Victor," Peter replied hesitantly. "He's more dangerous than you think." Margaret frowned. "He's not alone." Peter took a deep breath. "There's someone above him, controlling everything." A shiver ran down Margaret's spine. "Who?" she asked in a firm voice. Peter hesitated, knowing that revealing too much could be dangerous. "I can't say," he murmured, "but I know this person knows every penny, every move you make." "Then we're dealing with a greater threat than we imagined," Margaret said, studying every detail of his face. Peter finally revealed that Victor had been hired by someone with direct interest in the fund. Someone with power, resources, and patience, who wants the $120 million and will stop at nothing to get it. Margaret realized she needed to act quickly, or she would lose control of the situation. She decided to confront Victor directly. She scheduled a meeting at the bank, under the pretext of urgent technical adjustments, but this time she would not be a victim. Along the way, Margaret mentally reviewed every step, every trap, and every possibility. She knew Victor would try to manipulate the situation, but she was prepared for every move. Upon arriving, she realized that Victor was not alone. A bank executive who had seemed trustworthy for years was also involved. Margaret felt the shock. Someone she had long trusted was on the side of the enemies. She took a deep breath, keeping control. "Everything I do now has to be perfect," she murmured. If she made a mistake, there would be no going back. Victor tried to intimidate her, but Margaret was prepared. She discreetly activated her cell phone to record every word, every gesture. The entire meeting would become evidence against them. In the middle of the conversation, Peter entered discreetly, passing on information he had discovered outside the bank. Margaret smiled discreetly. Now she had an unexpected allies, and the balance was beginning to tip in her favor. The meeting became a psychological test. Every question Margaret asked was calculated. Every answer, Victor and the executive had recorded. She conducted them like a conductor conducts an orchestra. In the end, Margaret managed to record enough evidence to indict Victor, the executive, and any accomplices. She would not only survive the threat,
but turned the situation to her advantage. As she left the bank, Margaret felt a wave of relief. The first layer of the threat had been neutralized, but she knew there were still moving pieces. Peter walked her to the car without saying a word. The silence between them was filled with respect and tension. Both of them knew that the game wasn't over yet, but Margaret now had the upper hand. As she drove back home, she took a deep breath and looked out the window, wet from the recent rain. "This isn't over yet," she said quietly to herself. "But now I know exactly who the enemies are and how to defeat them."
Margaret woke early, the Maplewood sky still tinted orange by the rising sun. Today would not be an ordinary day. It would be the day to put an end to the threat that was looming over his life. She reviewed every plan, every detail of the past few weeks, calmly and determinedly. Nothing could go wrong. The detective and Peter were positioned discreetly, ready to act if anything got out of hand. Margaret smiled, feeling confidence growing within her. This time, it wouldn't be manipulated. She called Victor, asking for an urgent meeting at the bank. The urgent tone in Margaret's voice made him realize something was wrong. But it was too late. His every move was monitored. Upon arriving at the bank, Victor tried to act arrogant, believing he could still intimidate her. Margaret maintained a calm and confident demeanor. She knew she had recorded evidence, emails, transactions, and testimonies. The accomplice executive was present, trying to hide his nervousness. Margaret, with a slight smile, handed the copies of all the evidence to Peter and the detective. They recorded everything, documenting every detail. "Victor, this is your chance to cooperate," Margaret said, looking him directly in the eyes. "Denying it now will only make your situation worse," Peter added. The executive broke out in cold sweat, realizing the tables had turned. Victor tried to argue, but every word was recorded, every gesture captured by hidden cameras. Margaret was calm, but inside, she felt her adrenaline rising. She knew justice would be served. At the end of the meeting, Victor and the executive had no choice. They were forced to sign documents guaranteeing the end of attempts to access the fund. The threat network had been dismantled. Margaret sighed, feeling a mixture of relief and triumph. The money was safe, and she now knew exactly who to trust. Peter, watching, gave a slight nod of approval. Back home, Margaret prepared a simple dinner to celebrate with the children and Tom. The mood was light, but the feeling of victory still pulsed in his chest. She could finally relax, knowing the threat had been neutralized. As she served the food, Margaret reflected on what had happened. Every step, every plan, every decision had been crucial. She prided herself on her own courage and intelligence. The children played in the garden, oblivious to the danger that had loomed over them weeks ago. Margaret smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The future looked bright, with no shadows hanging over his family. Peter discreetly left the house, but not before recording every move of Victor and the executive. Margaret knew he would remain her ally in case of any unforeseen circumstances. The trust was now solid. That night, sitting on the porch, Margaret looked up at the starry sky. She thought about the entire path she had taken, the threats, the challenges, and the strategies. Each victory came from her own determination. She felt a wave of gratitude for Peter and the detective's unexpected support. Without them, I might not have been able to neutralize the threat with such precision. The lesson was clear. Strategic allies can change the game. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the feeling of triumph. The $120 million fund was safe, her family protected, and her secret intact. She knew that she could now live in peace,
but she would never let herself go again. The next day, Margaret decided to completely reorganize the security of her fortune. New vaults, passwords, fake accounts, and emergency protocols were implemented. Every detail was reviewed, ensuring maximum protection. She also strengthened her relationship with her family, keeping them away from danger, but informed enough to understand the importance of caution. The balance between safety and normality was delicate, but necessary. Margaret finally felt the freedom to live without fear. The past of threats and blackmail now belonged only to the memories that strengthened her. She was ready to start over, stronger and more determined than ever. As she prepared dinner for her family, she smiled softly. The danger had been neutralized, but the lessons would remain forever. She knew that true strength came from her own intelligence and courage. The children ran to hug her, smiling innocently. She hugged them tightly, feeling that the future finally belonged to them. The feeling of victory was complete. Peter, outside the window, watched from afar and waved discreetly. Margaret replied with a confident smile. Someone might try again, but now she was ready for any challenge. As the night wore on, Margaret sat alone, reflecting on the journey. Every threat, every twist, every test had strengthened her resolve. She knew that winning wasn't just about protecting the money, but also about protecting her family and her dignity. And with a last look at the safe house, she murmured, "Whoever tried to bring me down, lost. Whoever is by my side, won." If you enjoyed this story full of twists, turns, courage, and strategies, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories like this. Until the next adventure.